Various powers have come to have world hegemony on several occasions. One that transcended to the point of marking the transition between the modern and contemporary age was the First French Empire of the remembered Napoleon Bonaparte, which quickly extended over much of Europe and became the nightmare of the various absolute monarchies. Although, just as it spread quickly, its fall was also fast. Are you interested in knowing this important period of universal history? Alright, then stay until the end of the video. As always, let's look at the background. And as you might imagine, we have to go back to the French Revolution, in which the old regime of Louis XVI is abolished after the uprising of the French, giving rise to the First French Republic. All of this inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment. During this period, three forms of government succeeded each other. The first, the National Convention, based on a constituent assembly, where the Reign of Terror stands out, with about 1,300 executions to suppress counter-revolutionary actions. And of course, faced with the threat of republicanism, the various monarchies in the area would not stand idly by. Because of this, during this period, the first coalition would be formed, in which Austria, the United Kingdom, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, Naples, and Sardinia allied to invade France and stop the revolution. However, the French managed to resist, and in addition to maintaining the Republic, they managed to switch Spain to their side, annex the German region of Rhineland, the Austrian Netherlands, and transform the Netherlands into their first satellite state, now known as the Batavian Republic. In the midst of this first conflict, the government system would change to the Directory in 1795, the year when Napoleon Bonaparte enters the scene, who in command of the army front in Italy manages to reach agreements with Vienna. With this, his reputation would gradually rise, but probably the episode that would lead Napoleon to fame would be during the conflict against the Second Coalition in order to take the Suez Canal, an important geostrategic point of the United Kingdom towards India. Although he did not achieve his goal, this meant the rediscovery of the wonders of ancient Egypt. Despite this defeat, in the long run, the Second Coalition would end up being beneficial, as France manages to maintain the Republic and, in the face of British hostilities, gains a new ally, Denmark. In addition, it obtains new sister or satellite republics such as Switzerland, now the Helvetic Republic, and some Italian states. And how could France gain allies so quickly? Well, as you will see, the ideas of abolishing the old monarchical regimes were gaining popularity. Anyway, returning to Napoleon, his next step would be in November of 1799, in which, taking advantage of the political weakness of the Directory and an alleged conspiracy, the Directory is overthrown and the consulate begins with Bonaparte as the first consul. He monopolized power until he proclaimed himself consul for life. He was still monopolizing all the power until he proclaimed himself as consul for life. Napoleon's rise to power would be a new threat to the failed peace. They would organize for a third coalition, now made up of the United Kingdom, the Holy Empire, Austria, Russia, and Sweden. In the midst of this new conflict, Napoleon proclaims himself as emperor in a ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral, where he crowns himself and his consort Josephine. The First French Empire was born. The French Revolution was just an uprising against the monarchy. At this point, Napoleon was already seen by many as the savior that France needed to avoid falling into the hands of foreign monarchies that wanted to impose the old regime. From the beginning of his government, Napoleon was raising the weakened French economy, although he had to make some sacrifices such as the sale of Louisiana to the United States, disengage from power overseas to be able to afford the imminent war in Europe, a war that perhaps more than defending the hegemony of the continent. In the end, returning to the war, Napoleon would start with a failure after an attempt to invade the United Kingdom, in which the Anglo-Spanish fleet under the command of Wigner would surrender to Horatio Nelson's fleet. During the Battle of Trafalgar, in which the British admiral would lose his life in exchange for sealing a British naval victory and the prevention of invasion of the British Isles. However, the story on the ground front was different, as Napoleon would achieve a decisive victory against the Russo-Austrian forces during the Battle of Austerlitz, in which, due to poor coordination between Russia and Austria, the French managed to penetrate as far as the current Czech Republic and finish off the Allied army. This victory would mean the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire after more than 8 centuries of reign, from which certain territories would be annexed, in addition to creating a new satellite state known as the Confederation of the Rhine, agreed upon in the Treaty of Pressburg. In addition to this, Austria would lose influence in the Italian states and was forced to indemnify France. Yes, Napoleon was failing. And the little corporal didn't miss a thing, because now that he has hegemony over continental Europe and the British didn't let themselves be invaded, they had to deal with a trade blockade. Yes, maintaining peace was becoming increasingly unviable. Peace that would only last a few months, because in October of 1806, a fourth coalition would be formed, now mainly composed of Prussia, Russia and Saxony. Prussia would declare war on France for fear of an invasion after its defeat to Austria, a counterproductive act, as after the battles of Jena-Auerstadt, France reaches Berlin, from where they find and defeat the Russians in the Battle of Friedland. For this, it is worth noting that the legions of the disappeared Poland, exiled in France, had supported Napoleon from the beginning, so Prussia, in addition to ceding certain territory, would liberate Polish territory, thus creating a new satellite state known as the Duchy of Warsaw. As for Russia, it would be forced to the continental blockade against the United Kingdom and force Sweden to proceed in the same way. Despite his denial, continue as before. In the face of his denial, Russia invades then Swedish Finland, defeating the Swedes and annexing that territory with French support. And speaking of remaining neutral, Denmark would be attacked again by the United Kingdom for fear that its fleet would fall into Napoleon's hands on the British Isles. With this, it forces the Danes to the British Isles. With this, it forces the Danes to join the war on the French side. While the United Kingdom was already blocked on almost all sides, it still had a faithful and historic ally, Portugal. Because of this, using the excuse of invading Lisbon and taking advantage of the political disputes between Charles IV and his heir, Ferdinand. 7 Napoleon installs Bonaparte as king, deposing the House of Bourbon, with Bonaparte as king, deposing the House of Bourbon, which would turn Spain from an ally into a new satellite state. And as you can imagine, the fact that Spain went from being a hegemonic empire to a mere puppet state would not be accepted by everyone, which would lead to the start of the Spanish War of Independence, in which the nationalists supported by Portugal and the United Kingdom would face France supported by the Afrancesados and Poland. This would bring disastrous consequences for Spain, as taking advantage of this situation, wars would begin to occur in America that left it practically alone and that could not do much in the Iberian Peninsula. It would form the fifth coalition with Austria, who would have hegemony over the German states. The British would launch hegemony over the German states. The British would launch the failed Walcheren expedition in an attempt to take the base from the Austrian attack and from which they would be expelled. For their Austrian attack and from which they would be expelled. For their part, the Austrians tried to occupy the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, being defeated in the Battle of Racing. The following month, Napoleon arrives in Vienna, and after the Battle of Wagram, they push back the Austrians to Moravia, forcing them to sign the surrender in the Treaty of Schönbrunn, after which they cede Trieste and Dalmatia to France, Tyrol, and Salzburg to Bavaria, as well as territories to the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Wow! 5 coalitions and so far nothing at all. Despite France maintaining the hegemony of the continent, the prestige of wars and the high mortality of these. In response, the wars and the high mortality of these. In response, the government opted for media censorship and general repression, as it was distancing itself from the initial message of freedom of the revolution, right? External conflicts are added to the internal ones, since Russia breaks the agreement with France and gradually lifts the blockade on the United Kingdom. In response, Napoleon begins an invasion of Russia. But hold on, supposedly they were still fighting with Spain in the west then. Yet they would open a new front in the east to reach Moscow. I don't know who this reminds me of. And yes, as you might imagine, this was Napoleon's turning point, because no matter how many initial victories he achieved, they used a strategy where they kept retreating and used a strategy where they kept retreating and burning places along the way, to the point that the French found an abandoned capital with no provisions. Added to this is the cold winter and the Russian counterattack that forced him to abandon this failed invasion, which resulted in the death of about 400,000 soldiers. In the face of this terrible defeat, Napoleon's current and former enemies formed the Sixth Coalition in a new attempt to end with the Prussians in Lützen and Bautzen. On the Western Front is defeated in the Battle of Vittoria, which meant the definitive withdrawal of French troops in Spain and the subsequent return of the crown to Ferdinand VII. In this memorable battle, the remembered Duke of Wellington would participate. Remember this name. Napoleon's misfortunes would continue in the face of the failure to take Berlin and being subsequently cornered by the coalition forces in Leipzig, Saxony, thus initiating the largest confrontation of the Napoleonic Wars, and which meant both a military and a political defeat, in view that the Netherlands and some German states of the Rhine Confederation began to switch to the other side. And it is here, when they arrive in France in January of 1814 and arrive in Paris in March. With this, Napoleon is forced to the island of Elba, Italy, thus losing all the territories under his domain. In itself, the configuration of the in Vienna. Among the main changes is the new disintegration of Vienna. Among the main changes is the new disintegration of Poland, whose territory mainly passed to Russia. Austria recovers its Italian states. The UK gains new overseas territories, primarily from Italy. The United Kingdom obtains new overseas territories, mainly from the Netherlands. Denmark, a former ally of France, cedes Norway to Sweden. The Netherlands are unified, and the beginning of German unification, which would signify the start of the German unification, and which would signify the start of the rivalry between Austria and Prussia to be the axis of this unification. As for France, well, with the Bourbon restoration, the old regime against which they had fought would return, which meant the return of the exiled nobles who would be regaining their old rights and properties. As you can imagine, this generated a great deal of popular dissatisfaction, creating the perfect environment for Napoleon's return. That's right, on March 1st, 1815, Napoleon leaves his exile and returns to Paris to overthrow the newly restored Louis XVIII without using weapons. In fact, he is carried on shoulders to the Tuileries Palace to start the well-known 100 Days Empire. And of course, in the face of the return of the Little Corporal, the enemy powers formed the Seventh Coalition to put an end to this threat once and for all. In an act of anticipation, Napoleon would try to attack the Allied forces in present-day Belgium, managing to make the Prussians proceed in Ligny and Quatre Bras with troops under the command of Marshal Ney. However, Napoleon would fall to the coalition forces led by the Duke of Wellington. Do you remember him? In Waterloo, about 20 kilometers from Brussels, a battle that would mean the end of the 100 Days Empire, as well as the disastrous hope that he could find popular support. But on the contrary, he would be forced to abdicate in favor of a second Bourbon restoration, and this time his exile would be on the distant island of St. Helena, where he would spend the rest of his days remembering that for a short period he managed to position the hegemony of France like no successor ruler would ever achieve again. Despite his defeat, Napoleon's legacy had significant repercussions in Europe, as the democratic idealisms of the French Revolution and nationalism spread throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, with the start of various revolutions that would redraw the continent's borders. These nationalist ideals are reflected in subsequent events, such as the Italian and German unifications and the subsequent fall of continental empires, such as the Austrian and Ottoman, and the disastrous world wars that would end up defining the current map of Europe. And with bloodshed, has Napoleon's legacy been favorable for the history of Europe and consequently the world? Don't forget to leave your comment, and if you like this video, support me with a like and subscribe to my channel. And if you're interested in supporting this project, any donation on Patreon will be welcome. Until next time.